Alright, what's up everybody? Thanks for clicking this video. Thanks for tuning into my channel. My name is Simon Hill, Black American from Louisiana, aka Mr. Delks Moses, aka Mr. Anoints Himself with Grease, governed by Caprice. Today is April 8th, 2025. It's 10:15 p.m. where I'm at right now, coming to you live from Budapest, Hungary. This is Book to React 10, Part 10 of our reading of Racism in Europe from 1870 to the year 2000, written by a white professor in East Anglia University named Neil MacMaster. You can pick up this book on Amazon for the humble price of only $22.52 paperback, $66 hardcover. And yes, this book so far has been one of the most fascinating, informative, interesting reads that we've read in the Book to React series. And in the last class we finished the section covering the history of anti-Semitism in Europe, and now we're starting the post-war period of anti-black racism, mostly in Germany, and we're going to be reading those sections as well. Before we get into that, though, we will be starting with the comment section, because at the beginning of every Book to React video, we're always going to read at least one comment that we get under a Book to React video. This one from rsync9490 came in yesterday. We read that for yesterday's live stream. But this one, jblowU2m, said, "Is it any?" I have no idea what he is relating, what "is it any" means. I don't know what this comment means. Is there any? Maybe. Is there any country that's not anti-black? I think there wouldn't be, because we're living in a world of white supremacy. So that's the only comment we have. But shout out to everybody who's going to jump into the live stream and leave comments, and shout out to everybody who's going to leave comments under the video watching it during the playback. I also suggest for anybody who's going to be watching these videos on playback to watch them on 2x, as if you're a native English speaker, listening to this on 2x makes it go by much faster, and also you get all the information as well. So let's continue here. Anti-Black Racism in an Age of Total War. This is part 4 of the book, picking up on page 126 in the PDF, or 117 on the page. Let's go. So, Black Soldiers and Workers, 1914 to 1918. During the First World War, both Britain and France recruited an enormous number of colonial or native workers, soldiers, and sailors from their respective empires and moved them into the European theater of operations. France, which had a long tradition of imperial native regiments and which was most desperate to find replacement manpower for the millions of Frenchmen called to the front, had the least hesitation in calling on the patriotism of its subject peoples. In all, France mobilized some 300,000 colonial workers and 600,000 soldiers from Senegal, Indochina, Madagascar, China, Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco. That's amazing. In the book I read, Black and British by David Olusoga, he talks about how at the beginning of World War I, many Jamaican soldiers wanted to sign up to go fight on behalf of the Queen, right? And there's many reasons for that. It might seem hard for us to rationalize it, if we were living during those times. A primary reason for all of them, and I'll just summarize it, it was money, primarily. I mean, if you were a liberated black person living in Jamaica, post-slavery, you didn't have that many economic options, because many of the white folks who were the former slave owners still owned a lot of the land. You were probably working for your former slave master at minimal wages and stuff like that, so you didn't have a lot of opportunity. So many people were clawing at the chance to actually earn decent wages fighting in the war. Continuing here. Likewise, the British deployed 138,000 Indian troops, as well as workers from the West Indies, West Africa, South Africa, and China. If this number is added to the 200,000 black laborers and soldiers brought in by the U.S. Army, then the total of black and Asian men in Europe was in the region of 1.5 million. Europeans were confronted directly within the boundaries of their own societies with an unprecedented number of racially distinct people, and it is this contact which provides a rich source of historical evidence about early race relations. Nor was contact restricted to the War of 1914 or 1918, since although France, Britain, and the USA repatriated the majority of colonials and black GIs after the armistice, many tens of thousands stayed on and created the first large ethnic minority settlements, both in ports from Cardiff to Marseille, as well as in French industrial towns from Lyon and Paris to Lille in Metz. I mean, I would generally, if I was a black American living at that time and I got sent over to fight in France or fight in the UK, wherever, I would have stayed. I would have stayed my black ass there, started a whole new life, got a whole new name, learned the language, and just balled out of control. So, this process of post-war settlement led to the first manifestations of large-scale popular racism. For example, the demobilization of British soldiers and sailors coincided with a wave of race riots in British ports in 1919, while the French occupation of the Rhine with black colonial troops during 1919 and 1924 stirred up an extremely vicious racist campaign in Germany. The deployment of black and Asian soldiers and workers into Europe during the First World War was accompanied by the injection of highly racist practices and attitudes from colonial and ex-slave societies, particularly from the USA, into a European society that, on the whole, showed widespread popular tolerance or even friendship towards minorities. See, generally, when people meet the other, they sort of can put aside all of the BS that's been put into their brain about what happens in Africa or Asia and stuff like that, and they're generally cool. It just takes other people in their social groups or society at large to say, we are now going to treat this certain ethnic, visible minority differently. That makes people act in a lot of ways hostile. Where there was a long tradition of native regiments, as with the British, Sikh, and Gurkha or French North African battalions, commanding officers who were always white often held a paternalistic attitude towards their men, who were viewed as big children, whose intelligence was too low for them to act as officers or to understand the complexities of modern tactics. But when trained to respect white authority, the commanders could be proud of their endurance and courage. Racial myths of native savagery, especially the use of the knife or bayonets by Indians, Algerians, and Senegalese in hand-to-hand fighting, was deliberately cultivated and used as propaganda to intimidate the Germans. However, more negative racial attitudes were far more prevalent among white officers who brought into the European theater the prejudices and violence of colonial societies, from Algeria and South Africa to Australia, or the Jim Crow practices of the American South. White colonial societies and the colonial officers who controlled black units in Europe were, in general, strongly opposed to the deployment of native troops and workers in the metropolitan territory. As noted earlier, colonial powers tended to operate a twin-track system of state regulation, in which the extremely repressive apparatus intended to maintain an iron grip on colonial subjects, from systematic police and military violence to the denial of basic legal and political rights, stood in stark contrast to the more liberal climate in Europe and the respect for the rule of law and individual rights. Colonials generally believed that control over the millions of natives, the thin white line that protected settlers from being slaughtered and overrun, was fundamentally psychological. If the black population for an instant became aware of white self-doubt or anxiety, or could challenge the symbolic markers of European supremacy with impunity, then rebellion would inevitably follow. So basically what he's saying here is that, when they brought in these black, Asian, non-white peoples into Europe, right? They still were very heavy-handed with them because they didn't want these men going back to their colonies after the war ended to then challenge the white folks who were ruling over their nations, their lands, their former territories. Settlers reacted strongly against any attempts by home governments to introduce liberal or humane reforms into the colonies, since it was felt that European politicians, ignorant of the hard realities of colonial life, had no understanding of the importance of these special measures required to keep the native in his place, and that any tampering with the system threatened to put a match to the tinderbox. It was in this context that colonials feared that black troops or workers moved to Europe would become infected by the more liberal attitudes of metropolitan society, be treated with equality by whites, break down the barriers of segregation, and ultimate of horrors, enter into sexual relations with European women. This taste of freedom, along with contact with trade unions, left-wing and anti-colonial nationalist movements, would, it was feared, have a profound effect on the political consciousness of the blacks who, on demobilization, would bring these subversive influences home and undermine the racial order. A South African officer outraged that French ladies had served tea to white soldiers after black recruits, and in cups previously used by natives, exclaimed, "When you people get back to South Africa, don't start thinking that you are whites, just because this place has spoiled you. You are black and will stay black." Okay, that's wild. That's wild. I heard Elon Musk's daddy on Vlad TV say he's never heard of racism in South Africa. That's the funniest thing, because just hearing the average South African talk probably back then was like listening to like a Klansman on his hottest day. Continuing. It was also feared that blacks would not only learn sophisticated military skills that could be used in colonial rebellion, but that the act of fighting, killing, and defeating Germans would subvert the concept of white racial invulnerability. The South African government accepted that blacks should only be recruited as labor, not as combatants. As the East Rand Express remarked, the empire must uphold the principle that a colored man must not raise his hand against a white man if there is to be any law or order in either India, Africa, or any part of the empire where the white man rules over a large concourse of colored people. Such fears that native contact with European society would prove to have a dangerous, radicalizing impact turned out to be justified. Demobilized troops and workers provided a powerful impetus to the emergence of nationalist, anti-colonial movements throughout Africa and Asia, and black political consciousness was also raised in the USA, where a wave of post-war lynchings tried to put, as white racists proclaimed, those military French women ruined Negro soldiers back in their place. Why is it always the French women, by the way? They're never talking about the British women or the German women. It's always the French women that are loose with the goose. What is this? Anyway. In order to contain the dangers of political and moral corruption and to prevent the breaking of the mental chains of subservience, the French, British, and American commands introduced colonial segregationist and racist practices into Europe, practices that had an impact on public opinion. Black regiments and labor battalions were strictly segregated from contact with British and French society. For example, it was standard practice for Algerian, Senegalese, Black American, Indian, South African, and other colonial units to strictly control or ban off-duty visits to town centers and bars, and in particular to block invitations to French homes. American officers brought with them all the worst practices of the racist Southern states, including savage beatings of blacks by military police and preemptory hangings for charges of rape. Colonel Leonard of the U.S. Army drew up a circular, The Secret Information Concerning Black American Troops, which was distributed to French Army officers and local government officials, warning them of the need to avoid giving offense to white Americans by breaking segregationist practices and spelling out the dangerous consequences for the United States of blacks returning home infected by egalitarianism. You know, the crazy thing is the white supremacists say, oh, if we let the colored hordes into Europe, that they're going to bring their backwards culture, their backwards civilization, and they'll destroy Western civilization and values and stuff like that. But what we see every single time is that they resort to fascism. They resort to shooting themselves in their own foot, not having the best of the best people rise up to the top. No true meritocracy happening because of their fear of the black body, of their fear of the black man's penis, right? It all comes back down to the idea that we are the ones who are importing a bad culture. Meanwhile, these American officers were literally coming here, bringing in fascist policies to the people, right? And also the other people who were from the colonies, like the white South Africans, telling the French or the British, right, you need to make sure these people are under fascist rule as they're fighting for the freedom of all of us. Continuing here. The circular advised officials that the French should not eat with black officers, shake them by the hand, strike up any friendships, or permit contact with women. Far from trying to moderate the racism of American officers to fit the more tolerant climates of French society, Americans publicly lectured the French on the need to respect Jim Crow values and to collaborate in their implementation. Some Americans legitimated this by reference to scientific racism, like Major J.N. Merrill, commander of the 1st Black Battalion, of the Black 1st Battalion, not the 1st Black Battalion, but the Black 1st Battalion. So All right, Major J. N. Merrill, commander of the Black 1st Battalion, who held that all blacks were rank cowards who, if they fought well, only did so when individuals had a high percentage of white blood. Anthropology, he claimed, had shown through the measurements of the cranial capacities and facial angles, the Negro race has reached a state that will not improve and cannot improve. Similar attitudes could be found in colonial units. The South African command kept black workers in guarded compounds and prohibited entrance to shops unless under European escort. Likewise, the French army tried to isolate colonial workers from social contact with French civilians by segregating them in camps under strict militarized regimes. African soldiers on leave were not allowed to accept invitations to stay with French families, while in 1916, the Army Command issued instructions that female nurses were to be withdrawn from hospitals for injured colonial troops to prevent the development of liaisons. How successful were the armed forces in their segregationist aims, and did the colonial racism of the military elites have any impact on European society? The letters and autobiographical record left by colonial and black American soldiers show an unmistakable pattern of open acceptance from the French and British working class, a friendly welcome that was experienced with a sense of euphoric astonishment by those who had grown up inured to the arrogant insults, violence, and institutional racism of white colonial society. There are endless testaments like that of the American soldier who wrote to his mother, "These French people don't bother with no color line business. They treat us so good, and that the only time I ever know I'm colored is when I look in the glass." What appears to have been a genuine level of open tolerance by the French public was reinforced by the fact that black troops were feted as gallant fighters, come to risk their lives in the defense of the French Empire and the mother country. North Africans were welcomed into many French working-class homes, and the military authorities were unable to prevent close relationships developing between black troops and European women. Brothers gonna score, players gonna play, do it every day. It's how we live in the Bay, hey. Black and white soldiers inevitably came into close contact at the front and, through the shared hardship and danger of trench warfare, built up a sense of mutual respect and camaraderie. In 1918, about 50 West Indian limbless soldiers convalescing in a military hospital in Liverpool came under a violent, racially motivated attack by white soldiers who had served in South Africa, but were defended by some of the British Tommies who had fought side by side with these colored soldiers in the trenches. How sick do you have to beat up on soldiers because while they have no limbs? It says limbless West Indians, so 50 like Jamaicans, Grenadians, whatever, who have missing arms, legs, and stuff like that. And the South African soldiers wanted to be racist against them and beat them up, but the white British men came to defend them. There are some things as good allies, good white allies, but the best of white allies are the ones who fight against those in their own community, rather than come amongst us and tell us what to do. Similarly, French civilians intervened to protect black French subjects from assault by American military personnel. Such incidents illustrate the wide gap between colonial racism, which was deeply entrenched in senior military and administrative personnel who had served in the colonies, and the European lower middle and working classes who, in spite of the racist stereotyping of blacks in the media, appear to have been quite open-minded and ready to assess blacks directly and individually, according to their personal and human qualities. However, this generalized tolerance within the European working class did come under strain during the course of the war in the field of labor relations, and it was here that the first indications of popular anti-black racism can be located. This took on a particularly marked form in France, where the majority of black workers were located in labor battalions that supplied labor for the docks, quarries, mines, forestry work, or in the munitions, chemical, and gas industries. The trade unions objected that colonial workers were being deployed to undermine wage levels, and from the spring of 1917, as French society entered a deepening war crisis, African workers were subjected to increasing street level assault. African workers were subjected to increasing street-level assaults and eventually to large-scale riots like those in June 1917 in Dijon and Le Havre, where crowds of up to 1,500 people attacked local Moroccan barracks and killed 15 people. Women frequently demonstrated against colonial workers on the grounds that their deployment, husbands and sons to be replaced and then dispatched to the front, where they risked death or injury. Africans were also accused of strike-breaking activities, taking over women's work, or being a burden on scarce resources and eating the bread of the French workers. Sexual competition over women was a frequent cause of violence in bars, and Frenchmen perceived colonial workers as libidinous primitives and malingerers who, in the absence of husbands and fiancés who were risking their lives at the front, posed a predatory sexual threat to the honor of French women. So basically what they're saying here is that, the fear of men competing with each other for women caused a lot of the, violence and the pogroms against the soldiers and stuff like that. So, it's very interesting. I started watching this documentary on YouTube about French far-right feminism, basically French women who are against, like, the, rapid immigration that's happening in France from North Africa and other parts of Africa as well. And they couch a lot of that in feminism in the sense that, as feminists, they're here to protect themselves from these men who are also going to terrorize them as well. And as Neil MacMaster talks about right here, women were also protesting against these, foreign men because, they wanted to have opportunity in the labor market. Competition in the labor market seems to be the underlying cause for many of the disparities and tensions between groups in society. Demobilization and interwar racism. Economic racism continued on an extensive scale in Britain immediately after the end of the war, as tens of thousands of colonial and white seamen and soldiers were demobilized and found themselves in competition for housing and employment in the major ports. A series of major race riots erupted in South Wales, Cardiff, Newport, and Coddington, Liverpool, London, Glasgow, and Tyneside. Shipping lines had greatly increased their employment of cheap colonial labor from the 1870s, but instead of returning them on homebound ships as required by law, they were frequently abandoned in British ports, where they congregated in squalid lodging houses or settled permanently and married local women. During the war, thousands of black seamen were recruited, often facing great danger at sea. But with the armistice, 20,000 men were demobilized and stranded in British ports. White sailors, backed by their unions, demanded that the shipping lines give priority of employment to European seamen, while black sailors, many of whom were British subjects, protested that in spite of their enormous sacrifice in the defense of empire, they were being denied equality of treatment. As the secretary of the African Races Association of Glasgow wrote to the press in 1919, did not some of these men fight on the same battlefields with white men to defeat the enemy and make secure the British Empire? In Cardiff, Liverpool, and Glasgow, large crowds of up to 2,000 people, often led by ex-servicemen who deployed military tactics, laid siege to the black Dockland ghettos, destroying lodging houses and shops. During riots in London, a black seaman, William Samuel, was told by a police sergeant, "We want you N-words out of our country. This is a white man's country and not yours." I heard about William Samuel in the great book, Black and British, which you should pick up. Great story. There's more to the William Samuel story that's even more interesting. So, much of this rioting took place against a background of extreme labor unrest and turbulence, during which the government, frightened by Bolshevism and the imminence of communist-inspired revolution in Britain, deployed 12,000 troops and 6 tanks into Red Clydeside, and 3 battalion tanks, and a battleship and a destroyer into Liverpool. During the interwar period, both the French and British governments followed identical policies in trying to repatriate all black soldiers and workers, or where African labor was still deployed, as in the merchant navy, to place them under the most strict surveillance or segregationist practices. In general, the presence of inferior races was viewed as a threat to European society through miscegenation, criminality, the transmission of disease, and the formation of alien and unassimilated communities that endangered the national way of life. By 1912, the French authorities had, for example, rounded up and repatriated all but 5,000 of the 300,000 Algerians who had seen war service. while immediately after the 1919 riots, the British government repatriated many hundreds of seamen. See, I don't know how I feel about the repatriation thing. On one hand, I think people probably wanted to go home, but I think there were probably a lot of the people who said, well, I fought for this country. I deserve to live here too. And boy, the infrastructure in Paris is much better than Algiers. And they said, you gotta go. I don't think that was right. But then again, those guys should have went home and fought for their freedom, which a lot of them did. I mean, the Algerians fought bravely for their freedom. So, anyway, many black seamen and immigrant workers from the colonies were French or British subjects, and since they had, as passport holders, rights of entry and settlement, in practice it was difficult for the authorities to impose strict racist controls without breaking the law. However, both imperial powers succeeded in introducing mechanisms of racial subordination and control that reconstituted within a European context the segregationist and racial categories of colonial regimes. British shipping owners, faced with recession and declining profits, reinforced on board racial divisions between British sailors on standard articles or contracts and low-paid men on Asiatic articles. These divisions were then carried over into interracial dockside communities in which shipping lines and local police, backed by the India Office, collaborated in attempts to segregate black seamen from Europeans and from contact with trade unions. In 1925, the government introduced the Colored Alien Seamen Order, quietly achieved by order in council and without public debate, which exposed even black seamen who were British subjects to official registration, fingerprinting, identity photographs, police harassment, and enforced deportation. Likewise, French colonial governments, worried by migrant worker contact with the Communist Party and anti-colonial nationalist movements in the metropolis, pushed hard for severe restrictions on labor migration, as well as the establishment of special police intelligence units to infiltrate immigrant communities, segregated hostels and clinics, and a system of enforced deportation. The founder of the special police and welfare apparatus, the senior colonial official Octave Dupont, legitimated control and segregation with a paternalistic argument that North Africans were like big children who needed protection from the corrupting ways of Parisian society. Natives, he claimed, both needed and liked strong leadership. Our surveillance is not from them a form of subjection, but a protection. Better still, a state of happiness. In both France and Britain, such measures were initiated by colonial labor or police ministries and departments that were imbued with imperial assumptions of racial hierarchy, labor discipline, and control, such as the British India Office, the Colonial Office, and the British Board of Trade, and the French Ministry of the Interior, the Department of Algerian Native Affairs, and Ministry of Labor. The imposition of policies of racial subordination and control in Britain and France, enforced through administrative orders that were implemented without any parliamentary debates or control, were justified to the public through concerted propaganda campaigns. The authorities created a climate of opinion that would readily accept the necessity for special controls and policing through the dissemination of highly racialized images of black immigrants as primitive invaders who threatened European society through the transmission of dangerous microbes, criminal activity, pimping, drugs, gambling, by the sexual danger presented to women and children, rape, molestation, and the proliferation of squalid ghettos. Laura Tabile has argued that the recolonization and racialization of black minorities in interwar Britain was largely the work of state agencies and employers' organizations, acting in collusion with local police, town hall officials, and trade union leaders. The same dynamic of racialization in relation to Maghrebian immigrants can be found in interwar France. The origins of both racist propaganda as well as institutional racist practices can be traced to elites rather than to any initiatives or antipathy arising from the British or French working class. Very interesting here. So basically, the black people that tried to settle in the post-war period, they were going through a lot with the government. The government was sort of like putting downward pressure on them to like making it hostile to live there and disseminating racist propaganda for the black men and North African men who were just trying to make a life for themselves after leaving their countries to fight for the empire and now trying to piece together their lives with whatever they had. So, continuing here. Fear of miscegenation in Britain and France. The links between European racial science, colonial institutional racism, and the diffusion of racial prejudice in metropolitan society can be shown through the profound anxiety, even paranoia, that attached to the idea of racial mixing or miscegenation. This was such a central and continuous preoccupation throughout the period from 1900 to the Second World War that it will be examined in more detail for the insight that it can provide into the general process of racialization of European society. From an early stage in the development of slavery and plantation economies in the Americas, the control of large black populations by numerically tiny and vulnerable strata of white masters was, in part, achieved by the rigid control of sexual boundaries and the prevention of mixing between the two sides. The more racist the colonial regime then, in general, the more marked the legal or customary restrictions on intermarriage, as in the apartheid system of South Africa, or in the segregationist and lynch law practices of the American South. The economic and political rationale of such racial stratification is clear: to prevent the majority black population slowly achieving a degree of equality and upward social mobility and flooding the white elite, it was essential to prevent intermarriage and the appearance of a mixed race descent that was interstitial and ambiguous and a threat to the demarcation of clear racial boundaries. Whenever we see a word we don't know, we got to look it up. Interstitial. I feel like I've seen this word before, but this is a word that I still am not familiar with. Okay, and interstices. Okay, interstitial is the adjective. Okay, interstice is a noun. Okay, I'm going to put this in the chat right here so that we can learn together. Hold up. So, interstice is a noun, plural noun. Interstices, an intervening space, especially a very small one, sunshine filtered through the interstices of the arching trees. So looking back at the sentence, okay, was a spatial, ambiguous, and a threat to the demarcation of clear racial boundaries. Basically, it broke up the pattern of like white, maybe white, right? So interstitial in that sense. Continuing here. So entrenched were such values within white colonial societies through socialization, the maintenance of powerful taboos, religious doctrine, and the general cultural and social codes of correct speech, symbolic distancing, and avoidance of physical contact, that the very idea of proximity to the black body was associated with feelings of profound loathing, contamination, and staining, of dirt and disease. Reflecting the double standard of patriarchal European societies, particularly strong revulsion was felt towards sexual relations between a black man and a white woman, less so between a white master and a black servant. Why'd you use those words? Why not white man and black woman? Why'd you have to make it a slave dynamic, but black man and white woman is not? Anyway. Since such appropriation of the European female was regarded as the most powerful challenge to the status, honor, and the most intimate foundations of white male hegemony, the history of colonial societies is rife with the brutal beatings and murder of natives for overstepping the mark, making supposed slights and petty challenges to the symbolic order of white racial and sexual superiority. This was the central theme, worked out with deep psychological insight, or E.M. Forster's novel, A Passage to India, 1924. Periods of internal crisis within colonial regimes, stoked by fear of imminent black revolt and the uprising of servants within the domestic space, was frequently accompanied by the so-called Black Peril, powerful currents of panic and racial paranoia that were driven by unfounded rumors of the systematic rape of white women as an instrument of incipient race war. Interesting. It's always projection, right? Because they did the massive rape. They did the massive rape of our people, but they have this projection that, yeah, the black men or the North Africans, they're going to be the ones raping all the white women. Anyway, during the 19th century, it was a widely accepted practice within the British, French, and Dutch empires that European soldiers or administrators should regularly cohabit the native concubines, often in stable unions that led to the formation of mixed-race families. However, from about 1880 onwards, a deep shift within Western European societies towards a more puritanical and sexually repressive code linked to a cult of manliness and muscular Christianity was eventually translated into a strict regulation of sexual relations in the colonies. While earlier colonial regimes had largely tolerated white sexual relations with black women, often through prostitution, even such irregular contacts, let alone marriage, were increasingly regarded as immoral, a source of pollution, and degrading to the Europeans' sense of prestige, founded on segregation and a deepening apartheid. For example, the Crew Circular, a colonial service directive of 1909 on immoral relations with Native women, threatened severe penalties against any officials who engaged in concubinage. During the early 1900s, all Southern and Central African colonies legislated against sexual intercourse between black men and white women. Under the Southern Rhodesian Immorality Act of 1903, a black man resorting to a white prostitute could be imprisoned for 5 years. By the turn of the century, it was widely believed that colonial hegemony was crucially dependent on the maintenance of a white moral power, self-discipline, and the upholding of a correct social and spatial distance between Europeans and blacks through strict rules of segregation and etiquette. The taboo against interracial sex was also reinforced, as has been seen, by race science, which demonstrated that miscegenation inevitably brought about a process of physical and moral degeneration. A major concern that arose from the growing numbers of black males who entered Europe from the turn of the century was that without the constraints of the colonial regime, the repressive laws, codes of practice, and the threat of violence that normally contained the bestial instincts of the native and prevented him from associating with white women, the black would be unchained, a dangerous libidinal force set loose in the heart of civilization. Moreover, it was felt that European women, not realizing the dangers offered by natives, would naively break the codes of segregation and encourage physical contact. In 1899, the British press showed widespread disgust at the way in which English women flocked to get close to near-naked blacks appearing in the savage South Africa show. These women were not only, it was claimed, degrading themselves, but seriously weakening the empire, since colonists knew how crucial it was to keep natives, who are worse than brutes, when the passion is aroused, in subjection by a wholesale dread of the white man's powers, and that dread is being dissipated daily by familiar intercourses at Earl's Court. Following this daily mail campaign, the Earl's Court management barred women from entering the native kraal. Worse was to come with the marriage of one black performer, Prince Lobengula, to a Miss Florence Jewel. This is something inexpressibly disgusting, commented the Evening News, about the mating of a white girl with a dusky savage. While the Spectator noted, miscegenation has long been regarded by the Anglo-Saxon races as a curse against civilization. I think that's because deep down inside, the white man knows that, genetically they don't hold any of the dominant genes. And so this makes their paranoia of their genetic annihilation through the black penis. So there are endless incidents of this kind dating from the First World War and interwar period as the numbers of black people increased enormously in Britain and France. Negative reactions to black intermarriage and sexual relations were especially marked among ex-colonial officials, army personnel, and police officers who brought into European society the racist attitudes of colonial society, precisely because such officers and administrators claimed to have a special knowledge of native society and the primitive mind. They were able to carry particular weight with both government and public opinion, using their expertise to influence policy. During the race riots in Liverpool in 1919, black men, 1919, black men were blamed for associating with white women. Sir Ralph Williams, former governor of the Windward Islands, wrote, I gotta check something. Okay. Just checking right here. All right. So, anyway, sorry, I had a message from work. All right. So during the race riots in Liverpool in 1919, black men were blamed for associating with white women. Sir Ralph Williams, former governor of the Windward Islands, wrote to the Times, "To almost every white man and woman who has lived a life among colored races, intimate association between blacks or colored men and white women is a thing of horror. What blame to those white men who, seeing these conditions and loathing them, resort to violence? During the interwar period, eugenicists and race scientists, several of whom had visited South Africa, wrote at length on the psychological problems and vicious tendencies of half-caste children in the interracial port settlements of Cardiff and Liverpool, while the chief constable of Cardiff called for the introduction of legislation to prohibit interracial marriage on the lines of the South African Immorality Act of 1927. The French press, in similar vein, showed an almost obsessive concern with African immigrants, particularly the Algerian, as a sexually overcharged animal, a rapist, molester of children, vector of syphilis, and a threat to the purity and honor of French womanhood. Projection. When an unemployed and mentally ill migrant worker from Algeria killed 2 women in Paris in November 1923, it led to a widespread moral panic, crowd attacks on Arabs, and calls for stricter immigration controls. A deputy from the Paris region wrote, "Thousands of natives are terrorizing certain regions of France, certain sectors of Paris. They wallow in poverty, adding to the vices of the lower depths of the city, those which they carry in a state of gestation. Libidinous crimes are on the increase, rapes, abductions, while armed robberies are beyond count." Such racist perceptions did not, however, remain the monopoly of an educated elite. Politicians, journalists, novelists, colonial administrators, academics, and a host of others from the French and British bourgeoisie had tremendous power to influence public opinion, as well as specific policies relating to African migrants. They did so as the proprietors or editors of newspapers, as members of government, as senior officials in the police or in key ministries, as experts on health and tropical disease, missionaries, film directors, indeed all those that had their hands on the levers of state power or of cultural and educational expression. It was from this higher level that racist ideas and stereotypes filtered down into the wider society. Fear of miscegenation in Germany. This will be the last section we read today, so if you got any comments, got to get them out now. And let's go here. Fear of miscegenation in Germany. The powerful reaction against miscegenation was not confined only to the great imperial powers, Britain and France, but also developed in the infant colonial powers of Germany and Italy. Debates in the German Reichstag in 1904 on the systematic genocide deployed against the Nama and Herero peoples of Namibia were formulated in a dehumanizing rhetoric which described Africans as laboring animals, human material, and in an inversion of reality as bloodthirsty beasts in the forms of humans. A shift similar to that in British, French, and Dutch colonies occurred in the first decade of the 20th century towards more radical forms of racial demarcation, the maintenance of Aryan racial purity, and the criminalization of interracial marriage. Under pressure from the respectable colonial middle class of Windhoek, disproving a black country marriage between German farmers and native women, disproving a backcountry marriage between German farmers and native women, the colonial government issued an imperial ordinance outlawing interracial marriage in 1905. Similar codes followed for German East Africa in 1906 and Samoa in 1912. The latter ordinance, debated in the Reichstag, decreed that mixed marriages consecrated prior to the new code were legitimate and the children of such unions were juridically white. Juridically. I think it means juridicially. Because, juridically white. Okay, they were claimed white, even if they were mixed. While marriages entered into after the ordinance were illegitimate and the children deemed black and inferior. A perfect example of the arbitrary invention of racial categories. There's nothing better than that, right? So basically, the Germans said, they passed a law, hey, if you're mixed, but you were born before 1906, right, like you're white. But after 1906, you're black, right? Even if you have the same parents. So 2 hypothetical brothers or sisters or siblings, one could be white and one could be black depending on when they were born. Anyway, this measure, which caused some anxiety among Catholic conservatives, documented a major shift towards secular racist assumptions since the modern state was arrogating to itself the right to undo a sacrament on the basis of physical or biological features rather than on the grounds of religious belief, and it denied the humanity of indigenous peoples. All political parties from the agreed that miscegenation represented a danger to the racial purity of the German nation, while Mischling, or half-breeds, were inevitably unhealthy and corrupt, harmful to the national and racial interests. The outlawing of marriage with black natives bore a distinct parallel with the growing anti-Semitic belief that conversion to Christianity could not remove the essential racial characteristics of the Jew. However, while dehumanization of black people, genocidal practices, and racial ordinances could pass into law before 1914, an indicator of the large gap between colonial and metropolitan racial fields, no such measures could conceivably have been introduced at this time against the Jews in Germany. All right. So we're going to wrap it up here. We're going to pick up on this section, Race War and the Horror on the Rhine. We'll pick up with this section in our next reading. And we're taking this book bit by bit, piece by piece. Just 1 hour a day of reading is enough to cover this amazing book. I need some time to postulate and think about what we've just read, but a lot of this was very, very informative and a lot of new information. I suggest everybody watch this live stream and also watch the other parts of this series as well. We're almost finished. I think we're about halfway through the book, and I would say maybe we have 10 more parts before we wrap this up. This is probably going to be one of the fastest book reacts, other than that short one we did for the book Hood, which was only about 100 pages, but it's going to be the fastest, even though it's a bigger book, 257 pages. It's going to be the fastest because we're breaking it down every day, bit by bit, and just taking it slowly. So we appreciate everybody who's been supporting. The other videos have been going up, and even though nobody was in this live stream, hopefully people catch up to it. And once again, if you have any comments, put them in the chat. We're going to try to read them at the beginning of the next live stream. And if you have any other books that you think I should read, put it in the comments. Follow Backpack Bandits, the travel channel I share with my wife. Subscribe to this channel and listen to the movie reviews we do. And y'all be easy out there. Peace.